Welcome to the Boss It Weekly podcast, a no-nonsense, no-hype, frank and close-up analysis of what is currently working and what is not in the world of software. The Boss It podcast is packed with major takeaways for software business owners and managers. So, let's begin.
Hello and welcome to Boss It Podcast Season 2. I've got somebody very interesting for you to listen to today. Jeremy Brassington. I've met him a number of times, had a very interesting meeting the very first time. A lot of the things that he was saying really captured my attention and for a number of different reasons. He's running a software technology business. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his story, where he came from. And I think as most of us have found is that how we address the problems for today is based upon our experiences in the past, and I think that shapes us and that makes us all unique, and all our businesses are unique, and it's based upon our previous experience. So I think it's always interesting getting to understand that, and I think you'll see in this podcast that link really very, very clearly. And I think for those of you that are also you're running your own software technology business, the other thing that you're always looking for is how can you make your business successful? And I can see things that Jeremy is doing now that I think will drive that success. And he's had a number of breakthroughs as well. So, Jeremy, welcome to the Boss It podcast. Have you been on a podcast before?
No, I'm a podcast virgin. So,
another one.
So we'll see how we go.
Well, it's fairly easy. So starting off for you, tell us a little bit about your background and those things that you discussed with me actually the first time we met, because I said at the time I sat and smiled when we first met in London at the 8 Members Club, I think it was.
Yeah, that's right.
I sat and smiled because your story was really fascinating, and there were so many areas there. As always, I was very tempted to jump in and ask you lots and lots of questions, but I wanted you to talk and I wanted to listen. So tell that story as much as you remember it in the way that you told me, because I thought it was very, very interesting. How did things start for you? What was your background and what were your experiences with learning?
Okay. If I just start with where we are now and say that I'm chief executive of a software business that provides note-taking services and software to students who have learning disabilities, then we can then put everything in context in terms of where I come from.
Good point. So, I missed that. Putting it in context makes a very good point. So it's Note, because you've rebranded,
correct.
And the business is now NoteTaker Express.
NoteTaking Express. That's it.
Yes, NoteTaking Express. Okay.
So it was. I've been on a journey for some years now, and it was only sort of 12 months ago when we actually managed to connect my early life with what I'm doing now. And it was in the process of submitting a grant application for the European Union. And the guy who came to see me, Paul Tranter, said to one of my colleagues, really enjoyed meeting Jeremy, but I just don't know what makes him tick. He's very driven. He's got an ambition. He's committed to what he's doing, but I don't know what makes him tick. So this came back to me, and I thought, okay, that's really interesting. I now need to look at who I am critically and analyze why it is I'm doing what I'm doing.
Was that about understanding what motivated you?
Yes.
Okay.
I've never understood. I've always been referred to as the battery bunny. Never whatever the battery name is.
Duracell bunny.
Duracell bunny. But I've never known why. Yes. And over the last two years, I've actually begun to realize why. So the first part of the journey, which I went on, was I remember very little about my youth. And all I know is that when I was around about 3 years old, I was very unhappy. I also was at school and didn't learn and didn't like learning and was regarded as stupid. And it was only in later years that I realized that there had been some dysfunction in my life, which was I was actually orphaned when I was 3 years old because my mother had a nervous breakdown. So I've already caused one nervous breakdown in my life. Oh. And I got put into an orphanage. And by the age of 6, I couldn't read and I couldn't write. And I was seriously lost in terms of my education. And I was just piled on one side at the orphanage because they thought, well, he's never going to go anywhere. Hopefully he'll become a cook or something like that.
Yes.
And then I had a lucky break. And as I tell people, this was my first entrepreneurial deal. We went on a coach trip with some adults who didn't have children and were probably looking to adopt children. I didn't know this, didn't know the process, but I first of all sat on one couple's laps and then espied somebody who I thought looked far more interesting, went and sat on their lap, and the rest is history. They adopted me some 18 months later, and I went into a loving family who understood my learning issues.
So how old were you then when you were adopted?
I was 6.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
So still quite young, but I mean, a very formative time in your life. These early
absolutely.
experiences are really important to anybody. I mean, I think we can all relate to that.
Absolutely. And what they did was they sent me to a really good little prep school. My mother would sit, the cat sat on the mat, all those things, spelling, reading, writing, until I could actually read and write. And so that was my first experience of the education system, perhaps not picking up that, I wasn't stupid. And I had some learning difficulties, maybe partly because of the trauma of the process I'd been through, but also I think to do with my linguistic inability. And they got me back on track. And I then managed to get into a really good school, KCS in Wimbledon.
Yes.
And they recognised the native intelligence, dare I say it, and said, look, don't worry about the rest of it. We'll help him through it. And so they did. But as I grew up, I realised that, things like chemistry, things like maths were easy because they were symbols. I could do symbols, I could do numbers, and to this day I can still do numbers.
Yes.
And I fortunately got a place in Oxford. And when I got to Oxford, I realised that I was right back down the bottom of the heap again. I was the stupid one in the class. Everybody was much more intelligent than me, much more able to articulate things than me. And I've always struggled with writing the English language. It's always a struggle. And I remember Peter Baring, who employed me when I was in my 20s, said to me, this piece of work you've done, he said, this is very Accountanese, isn't it? And I looked at it and thought, oh, right. So this is not very good. So that's always been an issue. And then the event that I didn't really realize until 18 months ago that changed everything was when we got to the exams, everybody was revising. They were revising last year's papers of, questions that are by rote. So in other words, copy out the properties of phosphorus, sulfur, et cetera, I said to the guys, I can't do this. There's too much text. There's too much information. I'm going to do my own revision thing, which is basically formulating packets of data. Formulate those packets so that I can easily remember them and have a pattern, which I can go back to if I need to. And so I went into the exam. I felt underprepared. And I turned the paper over and I sat there for 5 minutes in shock because what the university had done is unilaterally changed the format of the exam to not being repeat by rote the following properties of all these different chemicals, but here are a set of facts. Here is a problem. We want you to solve the problem. Right. So with my workers toolkit, I said, wow, I love this. And instead of coming, number 250, as I was expected to do out of 250 chemists at Oxford, I actually came 37th and just missed a first by 10 places. Wow. So that illustrates that I have a different way of thinking from everybody else. Yes. My brain processes things in a different way. And when I articulated this to this guy, Paul Tranter, he said, got it. I had to read your email 3 times before I got it, because there's another story that I'll add on in a minute, which when we get to it. But that's part of me. It's part of my functioning. I process things differently, and therefore I have an affiliation or an allegiance with people who struggle to learn who struggle to do things in the traditional way.
It's interesting because I've interviewed lots of entrepreneurs, met lots of entrepreneurs within the software tech sector over many years, and there are the high achievers academically, but there are also those that have very much struggled in the traditional academic system as it was for them in their day. And it seems to be that has in some cases been the motivation to go out and create, not necessarily want to work in an organization. They want to go out and create something themselves. It seems to be one of those early experiences, possibly it just recurs quite a lot, that creates that entrepreneurial type of character. I don't know if you've seen that a lot. I know that some of the very, sort of well-known entrepreneurs, Richard Branson, for instance, I think he's a very good example of that.
I saw a lot of my school contemporaries who didn't make the grade and didn't go to university, and they were the ones who turned up at the open day some 10 years later in Bentleys and Rolls Royces.
Yes.
They couldn't cope with the education system, but they were bright, they were street smart, and they had they had the gene structure that enabled them to go out and shape a business which was successful.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of the other guys, who sort of sat in the library until 12 o'clock at night, would always go into, an employment status and never wanted to come out of that. They didn't want to take the risks. So it's not just your educational background or your inability to cope with things that shapes you. It's also the fact that you just don't want to fit into the mold. And I found that as I went through my career, I enjoyed going from a large company to a smaller company to an even smaller company because I had much more say and much more ability to influence what happens in the smaller company than I did in the big one. And I wasn't very good at politics. So, there are certain skill sets you need in large organizations. I did not have them.
Yes. Do you see yourself as also a risk taker? Are you willing to take risks?
Absolutely. I've taken risks all my life. I've made money. I've lost money. I've almost lost my house along the way. And the day my wife opened a letter that said from a bank saying you owe us £1.3 million, when are you going to pay it back? Yes. I nearly lost my wife as well. Yes. And I said to her, look, this is, I don't tell you all about this because I don't want you to be worried, but I know how I'm going to repay that money. I've taken some risks. I've made some investments, but it will all come good. And I paid the bank back. She was, well, she's not happy ever after because she knows I might take another risk. I continue to take risks. I'm going to take risks until they put me into a wooden box. I love doing it. It's in my genes.
Yes. No, I mean, and good for you. We need risk takers. One of the things that I was having a conversation yesterday with somebody, in all economies, no matter what country you are from, but I'm thinking particularly the UK is what probably some people are seeing quite challenging times. We need the risk takers. We need the entrepreneurs, and the UK in particular is very good in the software technology area. It is being seen. I think there was an article in the Times that came out a few days ago talking about this is an excellent place to come for business, but in particular around software technology. And it starts from somebody who has an idea and is willing to take a risk and try and create something of value from it. So you've done very well. You've got to Oxford University. You've done a degree in chemistry. You've performed very, very well in the finals when you weren't expected to, and it related to sort of learning styles and the way that your mind worked. How did that take you forward to get you to where you are now? Because
I didn't know anything else. I did a very traditional career. I became an accountant, so my numbers side was important in getting that qualification.
Yes.
I got rather bored with the limitations of accountancy, as you can imagine.
Yes.
But I had to have that skill set. I then went into merchant banking to Barings before they went bust.
Right.
And whilst I was at Barings, it was quite interesting. It was a very relaxed culture, and perhaps that's one of the reasons that they had some problems later on. But there were a number of us who actually set up our own businesses while we were at Barings, because
Okay.
you'd have periods of time when nothing was happening.
Right.
So our fertile minds would start thinking about, well, how can I set up a business on the side
Yes.
to actually keep me occupied and motivated. And then when a big deal came in, obviously your business had to take second place. But it was a culture where everybody was doing things slightly differently and slightly entrepreneurially. And then while I was there, I helped set up and became a founding partner of Baring Venture Partners, which was a European venture capital company,
Yes.
which became Baring Equity Partners or Baring Venture Partners. And we did a lot of technology investing. So I did a lot of investment with other people's money, OPM, during that period. Then after about 5 years, again, I started getting itchy feet because I felt, this is becoming too institutionalized, we're becoming too big. I don't focus in that sort of market. And so I then spun out into a turnaround fund. And that turnaround fund was to deal with companies that got into trouble, had probably 1 minute to midnight, just about to go into receivership. And so I learned the art of being able to pick the bones of companies that were going nowhere.
Well, let me just stop you, because there's a couple of interesting points
Yeah.
there. I'd like to ask you a few more
Yeah.
questions. So investment on the technology side, that's a great experience, a good place to be, because you're going to be looking at lots and lots of technology businesses. What did you learn from that period in your life? Because I can imagine, I mean, I know I've spoken to lots of investors in my time. Some of them they're getting literally dozens and dozens of investment opportunities. I get quite a lot sent to me. I've sent an investment deck yesterday to have a look at, and they vary enormously. What are the overriding things that you learnt from that time, and what did you sort of pick up in seeing all of those companies and their approaches?
I think the key lesson for me was that I was relatively young and inexperienced. And if I look back and say, would I take Jeremy Brassington as my investor director at that age, I would say no, because I didn't have the experience to influence and support the business that I was investing in for Barings.
Yes.
And what I see now sitting on the other side of the fence is that I'm looking to raise money. I'm looking for people who can make a real difference.
Yes.
And I want people who can help me do a gear shift, do a game change, that instead of us being targeting to be a $10 to $15 million business, they're helping us target being a $500 million or $1 billion business.
Yes.
So I actually, perhaps the ambitions of the entrepreneurs I met were not great enough. And that in itself might have been a warning to a more experienced individual.
Yes.
But secondly, I didn't think I was the right individual to actually take that business from where it was to where it needed to get to.
What were the common mistakes that you saw when people were sort of presenting to you? Were you in that position where you would sort of sit and they would pitch to you?
Yeah, I think a lot of them had great ideas, a great desire to succeed, but hadn't got a clue about business and didn't know how to put a business plan together properly. And actually, some of the best people were those that just came in with a clean sheet of paper and said, I've got this concept, I've got this idea, can you help me? Because then you can actually start to put some infrastructure around somebody like that who is a genuine visionary.
Yes.
And you can then start to put management teams around them, rather than the guy that thinks, I've written this business plan, I'm the managing director, and therefore I deserve to be the managing director for the entirety of this venture. Quite often that's not the case.
Yes.
You need a visionary, a guy who comes in with the idea, but you then need somebody to execute that vision. And quite often they're not the same people.
Making sure you've got the right people sitting in the right seats.
Yeah, it's all about people. It's all about building that infrastructure of people that you value and trust. And at each point in the equation, you've got to be able to question both yourself and those individuals and say, do I add value? Because if we don't, somebody else needs to come in.
One of the things that I see is, and I see this with a lot of the younger entrepreneurs, perhaps if this is their first venture, I have probably more conversations now with the companies at that stage than probably we did previously, because there is a massive opportunity in software tech because of the potential rate of growth. That's something, there's an enormous acceleration. We're seeing companies coming into the market, and because there is the money there, and because of the focus in this area, I mean, it's driving the digital transformation that the whole world, every individual, every business is going through that. That means there are massive opportunities, but there's a lot of competition. But we are seeing that the companies that get the formula right, and it's not just one aspect, you do need the vision, but you need many other aspects to get a great business in place. But those companies that are coming in, which we are interested to look for those, they seem to think that they have to get that investment. It's an essential step, and they have to get it almost immediately. And I think that there's a lot of people out there looking for funding, but the percentage that actually get it is relatively small because you only hear of the successes.
Yes.
And I think if they were to build a smaller operation that was self-funded, or maybe they're using sort of friends and colleagues to fund it, but a business unit that works, that they could show that they've got something that then needs scaling. I think that's a better way of going about things for a lot of them. Not always, because sometimes you do have to move very, very quickly. So once so then you also went into, looking at doing this sort of turnaround. Any thoughts and sort of main lessons that you learned from that?
Yeah, what I learned with the sort of basic turnaround business was that you'd normally buy a business too expensively, and quite often even a pound was too expensive because you took with you a whole load of overheads and baggage, even if you'd put it through a receivership or administration. And when you sold the business, because it was in a moribund industry, you never got the multiple that you deserved for the amount of effort that you put in.
Yes.
So what we then did was what I then did was say, fine, I happened to make some money on one or two technology investments that I'd made. A company called Oxford Molecular, which was a business we funded when I was at Bearings. I helped them after I left Bearings to go public, raise some money for them, and all the fees I just stuck in as equity. And they went from a 6 million startup to a 400 million turnover business. And that helped me fund the next stage of my life. So we then set up a technology turnaround business. So arguably higher risk, but the ones that we got right would actually be higher returns. So it was increasing the risk profile, putting the same amount of money in, but actually increasing the reward potential. So you can see my desire for risk-taking increasing here.
Yes.
And we did pretty well. We had some good successes, including, I might add, the company that I just talked about, who actually had to be restructured and turned around and sorted out. And we lent them £3 million to sell off all the businesses. And we got our money back, plus a very handsome return within 18 months. So that was the next phase. I then decided that I wanted to go even smaller and bought one of the businesses that we had in that portfolio out of the portfolio.
Yes.
So we'd had John Moulton and a number of other guys investing in it originally, and I bought them all out. And that was called Conversa. And that started to take me into the disability market, because Conversa makes assistive listening devices for the hard of hearing.
Okay.
And basically what that is in layman's terms is wireless directional microphones. So if you're sitting in a lecture, you're trying to listen to the lecturer, you've got noise between you and the speaker, you've got the effects of room reverberation, you've got people talking around you. And if you're wearing a hearing aid with a microphone, you won't be able to hear the speaker at the front of the room. So what you do is you place a microphone with the speaker, it wirelessly transmits to a receiver that's connected to your hearing aid, and you can then hear the speaker's voice clearly. So that was the next phase of my entrepreneurial career. And what I learned in that business was how to manage a business properly.
Yes.
It took a while. We had all sorts of problems in terms of patent estates, having to deal with patent defenses, dealing with, completely revamping the international distributor network and so on. But it got me into the disability market in a big way.
Yes.
And got me understanding the issues that individuals with disabilities have. And I think one of the key things that I've learned from that experience is that anybody who has a disability who is trying to learn either a job or is trying to learn in the academic environment has to work anything from 1.5 to 3 times as hard as somebody who doesn't have that disability. And I think a lot of us forget that. They just say, oh, well, he's got some software, he's a lucky guy, or he's got some pieces of kit, that solves his problem. Yes, it solves his problem, but it does it in a way which means that he has to actually identify he's got a disability. He then has to get support for that disability. He gets some equipment and some software for that disability, and he then has to work doubly hard to get the apple in the dumpling to actually achieve what he needs to achieve.
Yes, and this I can see the connections very clearly now, relating back to your own experiences. In a way, you were struggling in the very early years in being in an environment that wasn't suited to you, and in the same extent, that's often the case for people with disabilities. They've got ability, but it's just that they're in the wrong environment, or they haven't got the right support for them. And you're right, it means that they have to work much, much harder. That seemed to me, and this was one of the things that really stood out for me in listening to your story the very first time, is there was a link there between that Conversa business and where you are now. Tell us how you got to where you are now from there.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned the word microphone, and in the dyslexia market, the typical way to help someone with dyslexia overcome their disability is to give them a voice recorder.
Yes.
And a directional microphone so that they could record the lecture and then concentrate on what the speaker said and engaging with the class if it was a participative lecture. And so what somebody on the disability assessor side came to us and said, you make microphones, why don't you make a microphone for pairing up with a voice recorder? So we did. We found a microphone, we started selling them, and we were selling 10 or 15,000 a year. But a microphone is a microphone. It's me too. It was not a sustainable business on its own. And so I always regarded that as a sort of peripheral income that could come and go depending on competition.
Yes.
So then what happened was that one of the disability assessors on the DSA, Disabled Student Allowance Scheme, which is run by the government, came to me and said, did you know this microphone of yours works with an iPhone? And I said, no, I thought, there was a different connection. He said, oh, no. Here's a cable. Here's an app which can do voice recording. And if you could get that app developer to put bookmarks or tags into the recording so that the student could say, bookmark important points, the student would then be able to go back to that recording afterwards and go to the bookmark tag and say, right, that's the point I want to actually explore. It saves him time. He doesn't have to listen to the whole recording, and he's identified areas where he can actually then start creating content for his revision materials. If you could do that, and then you could interface it with, and I'm not going to mention their name, our key competitor who does a software program that uploads this to a PC, then you would have a product. Mm-hmm. So I said, very interesting. Let me go away. Give me 3 months. And in 3 months, I came back with a deal with what is now my major competitor, a cable, which I manufacture in China, and a package, which we then started selling to the Disabled Student Allowance Scheme for students with dyslexia. And we sold about 1,000 pieces. And people kept on coming to me and say, well, you've got it on the iPhone. Why don't you do it on Android? And I said, well, wait, there is no commercial opportunity here yet. This is just something that demonstrates. It's a prototype. It demonstrates that we can do it. But at the moment, the government buys voice recorders for students. It's quite happy to buy voice recorders. So until they stop that, we don't have a market.
How was that working in a classroom situation? So was this mainly being used by students who were recording their own notes, or were they going into a lecture situation and trying to pick up the lecture from where they sat? Because you need, I mean, proximity is important with microphones, which is where you sort of led to. How was that setup being used at that time?
It's a very interesting question, because if you want the perfect solution, the microphone on a digital voice recorder or on a smartphone is in the same position as a person with a hearing aid. So if you sit at the back of the class, you have noise between you and the speaker, you
Yes.
have room reverberations and all the other things.
Yes.
But when you're dealing with government, they're not going to buy a £300 assistive listening device to work with a voice recorder or a phone, because that's too expensive. So they will buy a £26 directional microphone that does part of the job that the wireless microphone does. In other words, it directionalizes the sound and focuses on forward-facing sounds,
Yes.
but it doesn't deal with all the other issues.
No,
So it's a cost issue.
Yes, there's a lot of ambient sound there
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
going to cause issues on the
Absolutely.
quality of that recording.
Absolutely. But I would argue that for students to remember things, you don't actually have to have a verbatim audio recording. You need to have things that you remember in terms of, the laugh after that particular comment by the lecturer was all about something that I thought was quite important. So I can pick that up whether or not it's clear or not. So I see a voice recording as being not necessarily one where you can actually do detailed transcription, but where you can pick up the atmosphere and the sense of the room, because you've been there, you were there, and you listened and you understood what was said. All you're
Right.
using the recording for is
Memory trigger
complementary.
or a memory trigger. Yeah, that
auditory
makes sense.
triggers. Auditory
Yes.
triggers. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people, even those who are assessing, don't really understand acoustics and don't really understand the workings of somebody who's got a different way of thinking. I may be shot down in flames on that one, because there are a lot of academics out there who would disagree. But
Yes.
from an acoustic perspective, I don't think you have to have absolutely everything.
But what that also requires is an understanding of how the mind works and how we remember things as
Yeah.
well. Because that links to that as well. So what happened after that?
Well, we trialed the solution, and then the government in 2014, bless them, decided to do, I can never remember what it's called. It's called a biz review. I think it's it's part of the DFE now. It's Business and Innovation Services Department decided to do a review of the whole of the DSA framework.
Yes.
And as soon as that was announced, I went, hooray, because I sensed an opportunity. I'm an entrepreneur. I look for change points. I
Yes.
love change. And I thought, this is tremendous, because what this is signaling to me is the government, who's been forking out tens of millions of pounds a year for disabled students, has made a statement where they say their remit should be on focusing on complex disabilities, and that universities should be responsible for the rest of the disability equation, so minor disabilities, including just many forms of dyslexia. So I just said, right, that's it. That's the trigger point I needed. We now have a market, or a potential market. And I then went to my competitor and the app developer and said, will you work with me to create an Android app? And they both turned me down. And I said, great. That's exactly what I wanted to hear, because I can now go and develop my own software. I can now go and develop my own apps, having never done this in my life before. And I can then create a product, which is what I did over the next 15 to 18 months as the government was deliberating.
Why was them turning you down a positive in your eyes?
Because I always saw it as an unstable relationship where they could at any point do that.
Right.
So I, again, like the microphones being a Me Too market, I realized that relying on third party to customize their app or their
Yes.
software for us was always vulnerable. So that brought control back to me, where I could be master of my own destiny.
And it's unlikely that 2 months later they were also going to develop their own app, because they'd already said to you that that wasn't in their plans. That's not something they wanted to do. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
They ultimately did, but that's fine.
Yes.
They followed our lead.
Yes, but you've got the lead by that stage. That's the important thing and you just need to maintain it, and you need to keep innovating. So where are you at now with this? Because I think, it's from when I first met you, I can see that you've made a lot of progress, and it's been very, very encouraging. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you onto this podcast, because I think there's a lot of people that listen to this, and there are very challenging times throughout your entrepreneurial career, but you're starting to make some really significant breakthroughs. Talk a little bit about what you offer now, those breakthroughs, and then perhaps where you see this going, what the vision is moving forward a bit, as much as you can.
Absolutely. The first key thing that I did was with our software, we record the lecture, we create bookmarks and allow the student to write text in those bookmark areas to associate the text with the audio. So someone with a cognitive processing issue, with dyslexia, they can associate words and text together, and they can just repeat that time and time again. So one of the things I did was that as the market was changing, people were saying, well, the universities are now going to have to support students with note takers. How are we going to do it? And there's a company called NoteTaking Express, which was being bounced around the forums as being a possible source of note taking. So I called the chief exec, Daniel Gertz of NoteTaking Express in Canada, and said, hi, this is who I am. It would be really rather neat if we could get your human note takers to put the text into the box for the student and pre-populate it for when they actually do their studies. So they have an audio recording, they have their PowerPoint slides, and then they have your note takers populate the program with the text, the summary text, not transcription, summary text, which is relevant to that piece. And he said, yeah, hey, great. Yeah, let's try it. And we tried it for a year, and then we realized that it wasn't working because we were called something different. We were called Note Talker. They were called NoteTaking Express, and it wasn't a joined-up solution. So it was our software, their note-taking service, and they had to be put together. So over a Skype call in March 2018, we'd started redeveloping our software. We just had Daniel, my other business partner, Graham, and myself on a Skype call. And we just said to Daniel, how does the apple get into the dumpling? How do you get your notes from the student to the note takers who are remote, and then back to the student? And as we went through this process, the light bulb went on in Canada, in the UK. And we said, do you know what? We're going to scrap this native software development we've spent £30,000 on. We're going to go web-based. And we're going to go web-based with an integrated solution that embraces both the note-taking mechanics and the software, and we will then deliver one platform to your customers in Canada. And he said, great, fantastic. I'd also funded him earlier in 2017 to expand into the US market. So by the time we had that conversation, he had around about 120 institutions in Canada and the USA. These were educational institutions, disability departments of educational institutions. And we said to him, when do you need this software by? And he said, September. And there was a brief pause where there were one or two silent expletives. And I looked at Graham and said, right, well, we got to get our act in gear. So we got our software developers on board, who we partly in-house and partly subcontract. And we said, right, the deadline is 1st of September, guys, and this is what we want. And sure enough, we launched the software, web-based software, on the 4th of September. Fortunately, there was a holiday on the 3rd of September, and the rest was a weekend. And we launched it to 167 customers who are ecstatic about what we've done. They absolutely love the way we've done it. They love the new user interface and the way we've cleaned it up and modernized it. And we now have 250 customers in the US and Canada, and it's growing at around about 100% per year in the US market, and more modestly in Canada because there are a smaller number of universities.
Sure.
So that was a big break for us. For finding NoteTaking Express, helping fund their expansion, then implementing a web-based software platform. And then in June, as part of this process, I was in New York. I was having dinner with Daniel, and we'd always talked about merging the two companies. And I said, right, Daniel, let's stop faffing around. We're joined at the hip because you can't exist without our software platform. We can't exist without your customer base in Canada and the United States. Let's put the two businesses together. So we did that, sorted, done, middle of 2018, and we haven't looked back. So that's where we are today. Those were the breaks. Those were the issues that we had to face. So you then said, well, what are we doing now? Well, we're going through the next phase and the next part of the vision. As part of our journey, we have been in discussion with a number of very large institutions who've been our customers for many years, who said to us, UDL, Universal Design for Learning, i.e. a solution to teach in different ways for people who learn in different ways so that we all become educated, i.e.
Yes.
There's no such thing as an average learner.
Yes.
We all learn differently. We all need to be taught differently, and we all need to be able to express our ideas differently.
Yes.
Okay? And it's been there for a long time, but it's never worked. And the other, I suppose, if you like, piece of dynamite that's coming down the pipeline is accessibility. And for those of you in the education industry that know about this, in Canada there is disability legislation that will mean that all educational, financial, government institutions will need to be accessible, i.e. every document, every program, every digital artifact and piece of information needs to be accessible to people who are blind, visually impaired, hearing impaired, deaf, cognitive processing issues, etc. And a lot of institutions have not got there. They don't know how to get there. And the technology is partly there, but nobody knows how to bring it all together. So what we've done is we've worked for the last 18 months with one of the largest colleges in Canada called George Brown College to formulate a digital accessibility project, which has culminated in us putting in a grant application to the federal government of Canada. It's a $17.5 million Canadian dollar project, and we've asked for $8 million of funding over 2 years. And this will produce a university-wide system for George Brown College, who have 800 classrooms, 115,000 students. And we have developed at the same time a video streaming camera, which is unique to us, which will stream the class video to our note takers. Within 1 hour of each class, the students, every student, not just those with disabilities, will have bullet point notes of that class. They will have slide presentations, they will have the notes, they will have the video, and then they can go away and do their studies. And for students who have a visual impairment or a hearing impairment or a deaf, we will be integrating modules into that universally applicable piece of software that means that all they have to do is press a button and say, I want a sign language interpreter, or I want captioned video, or I want descriptive audio. Those will be available at the press of a button. They don't look as though they're using any piece of software that's any different from anybody else, and this will be available for every student. And that's the goal that they have. And when you talk to other institutions about what we're doing, they basically say, well, when can we have it? When's it ready? Because that's the journey that they've got to go on. And it will happen here as well. The EU Accessibility Directive has been bites in 2020. And I was at an international forum yesterday organised by the Open University, and there are many institutions who haven't got a clue how they are going to address these accessibility issues. Some of the smarter ones, the more forward ones, yes, absolutely, no problem. But they're all sitting there saying, well, we don't have any money, we don't have a budget, we don't know how to do this. It's going nowhere. Mm-hmm. So that's why our focus is primarily on the US and Canadian markets, because they understand what needs to be done. They have the funds to do it.
It's a bigger market over there as well, isn't it?
And it's a bigger market, and it turns a $30 million disability market for us into a $3.5 billion opportunity. Where, if you took the top 20% of that market and said those are the guys who can afford it and are sufficiently far-sighted to implement it, you're looking at close to $1 billion of potential for us to access.
Yes, and then as markets tend to do is you will have those people that are the early adopters, but they will also help to put the pathway down for other solutions where you can start to penetrate, the other areas of the market where perhaps they haven't got as big budgets as you develop these solutions and systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the budget with this grant is educating other institutions, educational institutions, and secondly, we've got a workplace integrated learning module, which will deal with the transition from university to the workplace and enable students to take their technology with them. At the moment, in the UK and the US and Canada, students get accommodated at university. As soon as they leave university, the support disappears. They're in the workplace. And what the Canadian government wisely wants to do is say, if you've got a piece of technology that works for educational institutions, then that should work equally well in the workplace. And therefore, we want you to actually design something that is affordable for those individuals to take with them on their journey in life. So we will engage with banks like Scotiabank and a number of the others in Canada as part of this project.
So it seems to me that what will be driving this at the moment and where there will be budgets, and at the end of the day, what makes things happen is money, is the disability projects that are in place. But this can also be used on a much wider scale for remote learning.
Absolutely.
Traveling becomes harder and harder, and when you look in the UK, but it could also be used in the corporate world where you've got courses and programs that need to be delivered. It could apply there as well. But you're really focusing in, and this one of the phrases that I often use about niching down is seeing where that big opportunity is, and it's a very worthy one as well. I mean, it fits together very nicely. I mean, your whole story that you've told today on this podcast, that it's very coherent. It fits together. You can see there really is a journey here that you've been on. And what I like about it, it's the application of technology. It's your own experiences going through life, and it's being put to a really great need out there at the moment, which is enabling people that at the moment are disabled in one way or another, but it's helping them to even the playing fields in many respects, because this is, if there isn't something done in this area, governments are going to have to pay regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole thrust of the Canadian government's drive, is that of people who have disabilities, a very high proportion of those are not in work. And guess who's paying for that? The Canadian government.
Yes.
So this is what governments need to do.
They're putting in the money, but they're going to have to pay far more if they aren't able to provide education for people with disabilities. But it's working in a much more positive way. I mean, in the people's levels of their self-esteem, which is is a big driver in success. Yeah. So many knock-on positives, I think, with this project, and that's one of the reasons why I was so keen to talk to you today. What are your next steps? What are the next things you're focusing on, Jeremy?
Well, next steps are to strengthen the management team, and we're taking steps to do that. The other step that we've taken is, if we we need to scale up. And there are two ways you scale up, internally and externally. So on the internal front, we're implementing systems like Bamboo HR for our HR management, because we have almost 100 people working directly or indirectly for the business. And then the other one that we're using is something called Freshworks, which is a software as a service platform facilitator, where they take you or support you all the way from your CRM through your chat line, through intelligent chat lines, right the way through to your software development. So they provide you with bug reporting tools and ways of integrating your software team so that you have control over it. So we're doing both of those things. And then on the external side, we're working as an Amazon partner to look at ways of scaling up the note-taking process. So to make that more efficient, to even, dare I say, automate the summary note-taking process. It's easy enough to automate transcription, and lots of people have done it, but to automate summary notes is a very different kettle of fish, because you have to actually understand what has been written, so you can transcribe it.
It's not
analyze it.
It's not a case of just getting some typists just to do it. You have to be able to understand what's being said, so you can organize it in the right way.
Correct. And even if we only achieve a goal of semi-automation, so picking up, key points and putting them together for a note taker to actually assemble them, will have done part of that scaling up job, because we envisage having tens of thousands of students who require note taking, maybe even hundreds of thousands as we scale up, and we don't want to employ the whole of a desert island with computers on it. So it's all about understanding how we can actually grow this business both internally and externally to meet the challenges that we see ahead.
Well, fantastic story. I was hoping that it would be half as interesting as it has proved to be today. It's a little bit of a departure in many respects from what I've done on previous podcasts, and I was just able to just sort of let you roll on this one, because I think it's a fascinating story and a very worthy one. I'd like to actually suggest something slightly different with this podcast. If there are people out there that have got ideas, they've got technology, maybe they've got some contacts that they think could help Jeremy and NoteTaker Express, please get in contact with me, and I will obviously introduce you to Jeremy. I would love to see this project go, and if we can help to accelerate this in any way, we'll do everything that we can, because I think it's a very worthy cause, and it's a great example. And it's innovation, and it's the gem of which started here in the UK, which is also good for the UK. So it ticks a number of different boxes. Thank you very much for being on today's.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Excellent.
I always like talking.
Yeah. No, it's great, and it's you tick so many boxes here for the things that we're trying to do with our podcast, and I know that the people that listen to Boss It will find it very, very interesting. So thank you very much for that, and we'll be in contact again very soon. So this was the Boss It podcast. This was Jeremy Brassington talking about Note-Taking Express. Thoughts, ideas, comments, feedback, please post. We are on the Apple podcast. It's also on the Boss Equity website. Any feedbacks, my email address is medwards@bossequity.com. If you've got any thoughts, or if you've got future topics that you would like to cover, please get in contact. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much again, Jeremy, and I'll be speaking to you very soon.
Thanks.